I am Eleanor Johnson, but people usually call me Ellie. At the age of 89, I realize that my time left is not much, and there are stories that need to be told before it's too late. My story begins from the suffocating plantations of Georgia in the 1950s and extends to the present day. If you're looking for a gentle story with a simple, happy ending, this is not the story for you. Oh, my dear friend, I see you're still here. Very good. Pour yourself a cup of tea and sit down. My aging hands have become more tremulous, but my memories remain as clear as if everything happened just yesterday. There are secrets I've kept hidden for 7 decades, pains I've never shared with anyone, not even with those most dear to me. My life is not something you would see in Hollywood movies or romantic novels. It's filled with shocks, betrayals, and moments so dark that I thought I would never see the light again. But it also contains love, a love so intense that it can redeem even the most broken souls. Each wrinkle on my face, each bruise on these hands tells a story. I have been broken and risen so many times that I've lost count. I have felt fear to the bone and joy beyond all imagination. It was a life fully lived, not in the way I once dreamed, but in the way fate had arranged. So, if you are ready to listen, I am ready to share. Prepare yourself, because this is not an easy story to tell, nor is it easy to hear. But it is my story, the story of a little girl from Georgia who learned that survival is sometimes the strongest form of resistance. I was born in 1942 on a large plantation in rural Georgia. It was a beautiful place, but full of rigid rules and traditions that suffocated us. My father, Colonel William Johnson, was a man whom everyone respected and feared. He commanded not just our family, but almost the entire region. He was a politician who got what he wanted through force and influence. My mother, Mary Johnson, poor thing, was the opposite of my father, a quiet woman, always with a sad look in her eyes. She loved me very much, I know, but she couldn't do much to protect me. Sometimes, when my father wasn't looking, she would hug me tightly or stroke my hair. That was her way of telling me she was there for me. I had 3 older brothers: Joseph, the oldest, who was already married, Peter, the middle one, and Charles, the youngest of the boys. Joseph was the most like my father in temperament and bearing, always serious and bossy. His wife, Marion, was a quiet girl who had given him 2 children, Louis and Anna. Peter and Charles had inherited my father's rougher, qualities-ignorant men who only thought about horses, cattle, and ordering people around. But Joseph's children, my nephews Louis and Anna, were my joy. Louis was 7 and Anna was 5 when I was 13. They loved coming to play in the mansion. We would run through the gardens, hide in the enormous rooms, and I would tell them stories under the grand oak trees. Those were the only moments when I truly felt like a child. I was the youngest and the only girl. Father said I was the flower of the family, but that didn't mean I was treated better. In fact, the expectations placed on me were even greater. I had to be the perfect young lady, educated, obedient, and ready to be a good wife. It was in 1955, on the day I turned 13, that my life was turned upside down. I was excited, thinking I might have a little party, maybe even a cake. Good Lord, what I got as a present was a fiancé. Father called me into his office, and there stood a man I had only seen from afar a few times, Gerald Thompson, an important landowner in the region. He was 52 years old, with graying hair and a look that frightened me. "Ellie," my father said, "you're going to marry Mr. Thompson. It's a great honor for our family." I was paralyzed. Marry? I barely knew what that really meant. I looked at my mother, who was in a corner of the room, her eyes filled with tears. She said nothing, just lowered her head. I tried to argue, saying I was too young, that I wanted to study, but Father wouldn't hear it. "This is an agreement between men, girl. It will unite our families and bring more power to all of us." Suddenly, the house was full of people preparing for the wedding, seamstresses making my dress, cooks planning the banquet, my father receiving important visitors, and me in the middle of it all, feeling like I had been forgotten. My brothers didn't care. For them, it was normal for a girl to marry young. Joseph even congratulated me, as if it were a good thing. Peter and Charles only talked about how much money and acres of land the family would gain from the union. My nephews were the only ones who seemed to understand that something was wrong. Louis once asked me, "Aunt Ellie, why are you sad? Isn't marriage good?" And little Anna, with her innocence, said she didn't want me to go away. That broke my heart. The wedding day came too quickly. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but I felt like I was going to my own funeral. The dress was beautiful, full of lace and embroidery, but it weighed like lead on my shoulders. The church was packed. It seemed like the entire town had come to see Colonel William Johnson's daughter get married. When I entered, arm in arm with my father, I saw Gerald at the altar. He was smiling, but it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who had just closed a good deal. I repeated the words the priest said, placed the ring on Gerald's finger, and felt him place one on mine. Everything seemed to be happening to someone else, not to me. The celebration afterward was grandiose music, food, dancing, important people from everywhere. My father was radiant, boasting to the guests. My mother stayed in a corner, quiet as always. My brothers were drinking and laughing loudly. I saw my nephews from afar. Louis was holding Anna's hand, both looking at me with a mixture of confusion and sadness. I wanted to run to them, hug them, and tell them everything would be all right, but I knew I couldn't promise that. When night came, they took me to the bedroom, the room that would be mine and Gerald's. I sat there on the huge bed, trembling with fear. When Gerald entered, closed the door, and came toward me, I couldn't move. "Now you're my wife," he said, in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "Come here, I'll take off your dress and give you a bath." I had no choice but to obey. I won't tell you the details of that night. I can only say that I stopped being a girl and was forced to be a woman. When I was finally alone, I cried until I had no more tears. I cried for my lost childhood, for the dreams I had that now seemed impossible. I cried out of fear for the future that awaited me. The days following the wedding were a nightmare for me. Gerald wasn't a gentle or patient man. He expected me to be a real wife, even though I was just a girl. Behind closed doors, he made me go through things I didn't even understand. I would tremble just hearing his footsteps approaching the bedroom. If I complained or cried, he would become furious. "You're my wife now," he would say. "You have to obey me in everything." And when I tried to resist, he would threaten, "If you don't do what I want, you'll sleep with the pigs in the pen." At first, I thought it was just a threat to scare me, but one night, after I refused to do what he wanted because it was an absurd and degrading request, I saw in his eyes a rage that froze me to the bone. He grabbed me by the arm and dragged me outside, threw me in the pig pen, and locked the door. "Maybe this way you'll learn to be a good wife," he shouted. I spent the whole night there, naked in the mud, trembling with cold and fear, the horrible smell making me nauseous. In the morning, when he opened the door, I was dirty and crying. I thought that would be enough. But he brought me inside, bathed me, and forced me to do what I had refused. With yelling, "Who's in charge here? I am!" I can imagine your anger hearing this, my dear. I'm angry just telling it, but believe it or not, that wasn't the last time. There was another night he made me sleep there again. This time it was because I had burned dinner. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't concentrate properly in the kitchen. When he saw the burnt food, he turned red with anger. "To the pig pen," he said, and there I went again. At least this time I was wearing clothes. After those 2 nights, I learned to never complain or disobey again. I did everything he wanted, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how disgusted I felt. It was that, or the pig pen, and I couldn't stand that place anymore. I prayed to God to save me. Gerald always wanted to be intimate with me, whatever the time. He said a wife had to serve her husband. Even when I was having my monthly cycle, he wouldn't give me peace. Time passed, and I became increasingly sad and quiet. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, but I had no choice. I had to take care of the house, do the things Gerald demanded. It was during this time that I started feeling strange things: nausea, dizziness. At first, I thought I was sick, but I soon discovered I was pregnant. I had just turned 15. I was so afraid, how would I take care of a baby? But surprisingly, pregnancy gave me a little peace. Gerald became calmer. He didn't force me as much. I think he was afraid of hurting the baby. In 1957, my daughter Margaret Maggie Thompson was born. It was the first time since the wedding that I felt a bit of joy. When I held that little baby in my arms, I felt a love I didn't know existed. I promised myself I would protect her, that I wouldn't let anyone do to her what they had done to me. Taking care of Maggie gave me purpose. Gerald didn't care much for her. He said girls were worthless. That made me sad, but at least he didn't interfere much. I could spend hours with my daughter, singing, playing, forgetting a little about the difficult life I led. She nursed well. My little princess was always smiling. But the peace didn't last long. Soon, Gerald began demanding another child, and there I went again, being forced to do things I didn't want to do. In 1959, when I was 17, my son John Thompson was born. Gerald was very proud. He finally had his boy. He would throw parties for his friends, show the boy to everyone. He barely cared about me and Maggie. I loved both my children equally. To me, it didn't matter if it was a boy or a girl. They were my babies, my reason for living. I took care of them with all the love I could, trying to make up for their father's lack of love. I carried within me a constant fear that my John would grow up to be like Gerald, since my brothers were just like my father. Life continued like this until 1960, when I was 18. Something happened that changed my life again. On a hot summer afternoon, Gerald was on the porch, drinking as usual. Suddenly, he fell from his chair, clutching his chest. I ran to help, called the workers I saw in the distance tending to the cattle, but it was no use. By the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Gerald had died of a heart attack. I won't lie to you, when I realized he was really dead, I felt such relief that I even felt guilty. It was like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe without fear. I know it's not nice to talk like this, but it was the truth. That man had made my life a living hell since I was 13. But I soon realized that Gerald's death didn't mean my problems were over. Suddenly, I was a widow with 2 small children to raise, and the owner of a lot of things I didn't even know where to begin taking care of. Gerald's will left me the mansion and a good part of the lands. It was quite an inheritance. Everything the old man had belonged to his family for generations. The mansion was a beautiful 19th century construction, one of those you only see in movies. It had 25 rooms, all decorated with expensive furniture and antique objects. The gardens were breathtaking, full of flowers and century-old trees. In the first days, I would walk through those enormous corridors, hardly believing that it was all mine now. I had complicated feelings about the place. While it represented freedom from Gerald, it also held painful memories. Still, I could see a potential new beginning here. I imagined the children growing up in a different atmosphere than I had experienced with Gerald, perhaps finally finding peace in those spacious rooms and gardens. I had so many dreams and plans in my head. But the happiness didn't last long. Soon I began to realize the magnitude of the mess that had fallen into my lap. I knew nothing about managing lands, taking care of employees, dealing with money. In fact, I could barely read and write properly. And to make matters worse, Gerald's body had barely cooled when the trouble started. His 3 older children from his first marriage showed up, wanting their share of the inheritance. They were much older than me. Youngest must have been around 30. They looked at me as if I were an intruder, a gold digger. The legal battle began as soon as the will was opened. Gerald's children wasted no time. They hired the best lawyers in the region and began contesting everything. They said I was too young, that I didn't have the capacity to manage the properties, that Gerald wasn't in his right mind when he made the will. Each day brought a new accusation, a new paper to sign, a new hearing in court. I was completely lost. I had never set foot in a courtroom before. I barely knew what half the words the lawyers used meant. Every time a court summons arrived, my heart would race. I was afraid of losing everything, of ending up on the street with my small children. It was at that moment, when I thought there was no hope left, that I met Anthony Tony Miller. He was a recently graduated lawyer, full of ideas and a willingness to make a difference. He had heard about my case and offered to help me. At first, I confess I was a bit suspicious. I had seen so many men trying to take advantage of me that it was hard to believe someone could want to help without ulterior motives. His confident demeanor reminded me a bit of my father's authoritative presence. I thought it was a sign not to trust him. But Tony was different from all the men I had ever met. He treated me with respect, explained things to me patiently, didn't laugh at my questions no matter how silly they seemed. Gradually, I lowered my guard and began to trust him. Gerald's children didn't make anything easy. They used every dirty trick they could. They spread rumors in town that I had found a way to kill Gerald to get the inheritance. They tried to bribe witnesses, threatened people close to me. There was even a time when they tried to intimidate me directly, cornering me at the exit of the courthouse. If Tony hadn't appeared at that moment, I don't know what would have happened. But despite all the pressure, we didn't give up. Tony gathered evidence, built our case, taught me how to behave in court, how not to fall into the traps the other lawyers set. Gradually, I gained confidence, learning to defend myself. The legal battle dragged on for almost 2 years. When the day of the final verdict finally came, I was a nervous wreck. The judge read the decision, and when he announced that the will was valid and that I had the right to keep the mansion and the lands, it was as if the world had stopped for a moment. I couldn't believe it at first. I left the courthouse that day feeling like the strongest woman in the world. I had faced everything and everyone, and I had won. For the first time in my life, I felt that the future was mine to shape as I wished. But as with everything in my life at that time, my joy didn't last long. That same night, while I was at home with the children trying to celebrate our victory, I heard the sound of a truck arriving. Before I could understand what was happening, my father, Colonel William Johnson, and my brothers invaded the house. They seemed possessed, shouting that I was too young to manage all of that. "You don't have the capacity to take care of these lands, girl," my father yelled, while my brothers started grabbing the children. I screamed and tried to stop them, but they were stronger. I watched in horror as they put Maggie and John in the truck. My little ones were crying their hearts out. "Where are you taking my children?" I begged, but no one would listen to me. My father grabbed me by the arm, dragging me to the truck as well. "We're going home. We'll resolve this there." When we arrived at my parents' plantation, I saw my mother waiting on the porch. She looked sad but did nothing to help me. She just stood there, quiet, while my father pushed me inside the house. "We're going to take care of everything now," he said in that tone that didn't accept discussion. "You're too young to deal with this kind of thing." I spent the night crying, hugging my children. I didn't understand how my own family could do this to me. The next morning, to my surprise, Tony showed up at the plantation. He arrived with a folder under his arm, telling my father he had some documents I needed to sign, things that had remained pending from the legal process. My father didn't like the idea much, but since it was something official, he ended up letting Tony talk to me. We went to my grandfather's old office, a room somewhat distant from the living room. As soon as the door closed, I saw that Tony was agitated, worried. "Ellie," he said softly, looking at the door to make sure no one was listening. "There are no documents to sign. I came here to warn you. I discovered something you need to know." He came closer, speaking almost in a whisper. "Your father made a deal with Gerald's children. They're going to sell everything and split the money. Since the judge didn't give the inheritance to them, they found another way to get what they wanted." I felt my blood freeze in my veins. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tony continued, "They're using your father's influence and family pressure to force you to sell. Your father is telling everyone that you don't have the experience to manage the assets, that it's better to sell everything." I was floored. All that effort, all that struggle in court, and now my own father was handing everything over to Gerald's children and taking a part for himself. How outrageous. "But how can they do this?" I asked, desperate with the news. "The inheritance is mine," the judge decided. "I'm of legal age. They can't force me." Tony shook his head, frustrated. "Legally, they can't force you, but in practice, with the family pressure and your father's influence in the region." At that moment, I understood the magnitude of the betrayal. My own family had turned against me, all because of money and power. And it wasn't the first time. I felt cornered. Shortly after Tony told me everything, the office door suddenly opened. My brother Peter entered, his eyes suspicious, looking from me to Tony. At that moment, I saw Tony change completely. In the blink of an eye, he returned to being the formal lawyer, calmly closing his briefcase. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Ellie," he said, his voice betraying nothing of what we had just talked about. "If there's anything else, I'll return to finalize the paperwork." I was impressed with how well he disguised it. If I didn't know what had just happened, I would have sworn it was just a routine visit from my lawyer. Peter stood at the door, watching as Tony politely said goodbye and left. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my heart was racing. As soon as Tony left, I felt an enormous emptiness. He was the only one who was really on my side, the only one who cared about what I wanted. Seeing him go, I felt more alone than ever. Peter kept staring at me as if trying to guess what had happened there, but I wasn't going to give in. I raised my chin and walked straight past him out of the office. What Tony had told me that day in my grandfather's office proved to be true faster than I had imagined. Not even a week had passed when my father, Colonel William Johnson, entered the room where I was with the children, carrying a folder full of papers. "Ellie," he said with that authoritative voice, "I need you to sign these documents." I already knew what it was. My heart started beating fast. My hands turned cold. "What documents, Father?" I asked, trying to buy time. He threw the papers on the bedside table. "It's the sale of the mansion and the lands. I've arranged everything with the buyers. Only your signature is missing." I looked at the papers and felt as if the ground had disappeared from under my feet. It was everything I had fought to get. Everything the judge had said was rightfully mine. "But Father," I tried to argue, "the judge said it was mine. It's the inheritance that Gerald left for me and my children. How can you sell it?" "I don't want to sell. I want to live there with the children," I said, trying to appear smart and determined. Colonel William Johnson slammed his hand on the table, making me jump with fright. Maggie, who was playing on the floor, started crying. "Don't come to me with this talk of judges," he shouted. "You're a girl who has barely left the diapers. You don't have the capacity to take care of any land. I'm doing this for your own good." I picked up Maggie, trying to calm her. John, though small, looked frightened at his grandfather. "Father, I won't sign," I insisted, trying to sound more courageous than I felt. "This inheritance is the future of my children. I cannot give it up." That's when I saw in his eyes a gleam that frightened me. He leaned toward me and said quietly, "If you don't sign, Ellie, I'll send your children to a boarding school in Europe. You won't see them again until they turn 18. I felt as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over me. "You can't do that," I said, my voice trembling. "Yes, I can," he replied coldly. "I'm their grandfather. I can say that you don't have the conditions to raise these children. Who do you think the authorities will listen to, a 19-year-old widow or a respected colonel?" At that moment, I understood that I was cornered. I looked at Maggie in my arms, at John sitting on the bed. They were my babies, my reason for living. Just thinking about being away from them for years was a pain I couldn't even imagine. And my father wasn't a man of just threats. If he said it, he would certainly do it. With a heavy heart, I took the pen my father offered me. Each signature on those papers was like tearing off a piece of myself. When I finished, I felt empty, defeated. My father took the papers, satisfied. "You did the right thing, girl. Let me take care of everything now." As for my brothers, Peter and Charles barely acknowledged me during this time. They were busy with the plantation business and their own affairs, showing little interest in my situation or my children's welfare. Joseph at least showed some concern, occasionally asking about Maggie and John, though he never openly defied our father. And that's how, in the blink of an eye, I lost everything I had fought so hard to get: the mansion, the lands, the chance to give a better future to my children. Everything had gone with those signatures. In the days that followed, I watched my father take control of everything. He managed the money from the sale as if it were his, deciding where and how to spend it. "You're too young to handle so much money, Ellie," he would always say whenever I tried to question him. "Let me take care of this for you." I suddenly found myself back at square one. It was as if I had gone back in time to before I married Gerald. I was again under the oppressive control of my father, only now with 2 small children to raise. The difference was that now I knew the taste of freedom. I knew what it was like to have control of my own life, and that made everything even harder to bear. My mother, Mary Johnson, tried to comfort me in her way. Sometimes when my father wasn't around, she would come to my room, sit on the edge of the bed, and hold my hand. We would talk about the children, and that was it. She never took my side. "Everything will be fine, my daughter," she would say softly. "Your father only wants the best for you and the children." But I could see in her eyes that not even she believed that. Mary had spent her entire life submitting to my father's wishes. She knew better than anyone what it was like to live under his control. "Mother," I asked once, "have you ever thought about leaving here, about saying no to father?" She gave a sad smile. "Oh, my daughter, women like us don't have that luxury. We learn to survive as best we can." Those words broke my heart. I didn't want that life for me. I didn't want that for my children. But what could I do? I was trapped without money, without support. The days went by, and I felt increasingly suffocated under my father's oppressive control. I watched him spending the money from the sale on things he wanted, making business deals, buying more land sand. There I was, unable to say anything, having to ask permission even to buy clothes for my children. But there was one thing that wouldn't leave my mind, Tony, the young lawyer who had fought so hard for me, who had been the only one to really care about what I wanted. I thought about him always. I imagined that he could be my husband, a good man. But it was all in my head. At no point did he hint that he wanted anything with me, and I didn't either. It was only when I was alone, back at my parents' house, that I began to think of him in this way. I don't know what changed inside me, but I remember it was exactly like that. I noticed my feelings change. It was as if, away from him, I had begun to see Tony differently. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was because, compared to the men I knew, my father, my brothers, the late Gerald, Tony seemed almost unreal. He was so good. He respected me, listened to me, fought for my rights. It was hard not to dream of someone like that. But I knew they were just dreams, fantasies of a young woman trapped in a life she didn't choose. Tony probably didn't even think of me that way. To him, I must have been just another client, a girl with problems, and he would never get involved in such trouble. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was as if, without me realizing it, Tony had become a kind of safe haven in my thoughts, a place I could escape to, even if only in my imagination, when things got too difficult. The months passed, and I was already accepting the life I had. It wasn't what I dreamed of, but at least my children were well. Maggie and John were healthy and, thank God, well treated by everyone on the plantation. Even my strict father, Colonel William Johnson, seemed to have a softer side when he was with his grandchildren. It was on a hot summer afternoon that everything changed again. I was on the porch, watching the children play in the yard, when one of the workers came to call me. "Mrs. Ellie, the Colonel wants to see you in the office." I felt a chill in my stomach. Usually, when my father called me to the office, it wasn't good. I straightened my dress, took a deep breath, and went. When I entered the office, the first thing I saw was my father sitting behind his massive solid wood desk. But soon my eyes fixed on the other person in the room. My heart almost stopped. It was Tony, standing there in his well-pressed suit with that smile that lit up his entire face. My prince. That's how I saw him in my dreams, in my secret fantasies. "Sit down, Ellie," my father said, bringing me back to reality. I sat, trying to control the trembling in my hands. What was Tony doing there? "Ellie," my father began, "Dr. Tony here came to make me a request. He wants to marry you. I want to know what you think. Do you want to marry him?" I was stunned. I never imagined my father would actually consider allowing me to marry a man of my choosing, especially after what happened with Gerald. I couldn't understand why he would even entertain Tony's request, but I wasn't about to question this unexpected opportunity. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Marry? Tony and me? My father, the man who had controlled every aspect of my life until then, was giving me a choice? But at that moment, It was as if God had heard my prayers. All my dreams had suddenly become reality. I looked at Tony, who was looking at me with those gentle eyes, then at my father, who was waiting for an answer. I didn't even need to think. "Yes," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. "I accept." My father seemed satisfied. Tony smiled that smile that made my heart melt. We spent some time working out details, talking about dates, arrangements. I barely listened. I was floating on a cloud of happiness. Only when my father left us alone for a moment did the story begin to reveal itself. Tony turned to me, his face serious. "Ellie," he said softly, "there's something you need to know." I felt my heart tighten. I thought it was too good to be true. He told me that a friend of his had heard that my father was looking for a husband for me. There were few suitors, mainly because everyone knew about Colonel William Johnson's difficult temperament. "I couldn't bear the thought of seeing you married to some old landowner that your father would choose," Tony said, his eyes full of emotion. "So I lied to your father." I was confused. "Lied? How?" Tony sighed. "I told him I was very rich, that I could pay a high dowry for the privilege of marrying the colonel's daughter." I was amazed. It was all business for my father, as always, and I, as usual, was once again a bargaining chip. "But Tony," I said, "if you don't have that money, how will you pay this dowry?" He lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I don't know yet, Ellie." He took my hands, looked into my eyes, and said something that changed everything. "I did this because I wanted to save you, Ellie. I feel so much affection for you and the children. I couldn't let you marry someone you didn't love again, someone your father would choose just for the money." My heart was beating so hard I thought he could hear it. Tony continued, "I know it's crazy, but if you want to be with me, I'll find a way for us to escape from here, start a new life away from your father, away from all this." Before I could respond, Tony leaned in and kissed me. It was a gentle kiss, full of promises and possibilities. When we parted, I was even more in love than before. What a wonderful kiss, my God. "I think about you too, Tony," I confessed, the words coming out almost in a whisper. I accept everything you want." At that moment, it was as if the whole world had disappeared. There were only Tony and I, and the promise of a future together. But reality soon imposed itself. We heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved apart. My father entered the office again, still talking about arrangements and plans. In the days that followed, the plantation turned into a buzz. My father announced the engagement with all the pomp he could gather. For him, it was a great victory, his widowed daughter marrying a rich and respected lawyer. Tony gained permission to visit me almost every day, always under the watchful eye of my mother or some maid. But we managed to exchange glances, discreet touches, whispered words. During one of these visits, he secretly passed me a note, which I read as soon as I had the opportunity, with trembling hands. I opened the folded paper. On it, in Tony's hurried handwriting, was written, "Be at the front gate with the children at 11 at night. I'll pick you up." My heart raced. This was either chance to escape, to freedom. I spent the rest of the day anxious. Every time I looked at the clock, time seemed not to pass. When night finally came, I waited for everyone to go to sleep, with my heart in my mouth. I packed a small bundle with some of our clothes and our documents, which I couldn't leave behind. I woke up Maggie. "We're going on a trip, my daughter," I whispered as I bundled her up. Poor thing, she was just 3 years old and didn't want to know. She just wanted to sleep. But I couldn't carry both children. My plan was to carry 1-year-old John in my arms, but with the 2 bags, there was no other way. I ended up half carrying, half guiding Maggie, while holding John and our belongings. We left without making any noise. The gate was far. I had to walk quite a bit, my arms almost falling off. I got tangled up because of Maggie. Oh, my daughter, it was such a struggle. It was already past midnight when we got there. I looked around, and where was the man? There wasn't a soul in sight. Immediately I felt something and started crying like a child. Maggie, poor thing, didn't understand anything, kept asking what was happening. Then, thank God, I heard a whistle from afar. I squinted to see better in the dark. And there he was, Tony. The car was hidden in the bushes. You could barely see it. Suddenly he turned on those headlights. Mercy, what a relief! The man jumped out of the car like lightning and came to help us quickly. Quickly, he kept saying, looking around like a hunted animal. It was all very fast. We left in the darkness of the night, leaving behind the only life I had known. The children fell asleep in the back seat. I alternated between looking at them and at the road ahead, uncertain of what awaited us. After several hours of travel, we arrived in a welcoming town. Tony drove to a simple house on the outskirts, with a well-tended garden in front. An elegant lady with gray hair was waiting for us at the door, her face a mixture of anxiety and relief. "This is my mother," Tony explained, a tired smile on his lips. "You'll stay here for now." Tony's mother, Louise Miller, received us with a tight hug. Her eyes were gentle and warm, but I could see the concern in them. Come in," she said, making hurried gestures. "You must be exhausted, poor things." Upon entering the house, I was surprised by what I saw. Everything was prepared to receive us. Louise took us to a room that, according to her, was Tony's old room. Now there was a double bed arranged with clean sheets, and beside it, a white wicker crib for John. "I prepared everything for you," Louise said with a shy smile. "I hope it's good. It's not the luxury you're used to, but it's from the heart." At that moment, I felt a wave of gratitude and emotion wash over me. It was serious what Tony wanted with me. Certainly, his mother knew my whole story, and even so, she decided to welcome me. I started crying and thanked her. Later, while the children slept, Louise told me a bit of her story. She had been a widow for 15 years. Her husband, Romulus, Tony's father, had also been a lawyer. He died of tuberculosis when Tony was just a young man. I could see the pride in her eyes when she talked about her son, about how he had followed in his father's footsteps. That first night, Tony didn't want to sleep in the same room as us. "We'll get married first," he said with a shy smile. I admired his honor and respect, even in that complicated situation. In the days that followed, I met Tony's siblings. The oldest, August, was a doctor and lived in the house next door with his wife, Susan, and their 2 children, Alfred and Amelia. The middle sister, Catherine, was a teacher and lived a few streets below with her husband, Louis, and daughter, Emily. They would visit us frequently, bringing food, clothes for the children, and words of comfort. Everyone knew our story. They were good, welcoming people. But I noticed they were wary of our situation. The worried looks and whispered conversations didn't escape me. One night, about 3 days after our arrival, I heard a heated discussion in the kitchen. I approached the door silently and listened. "Are you crazy, Tony?" It was August's voice, the older brother. "She's a colonel's daughter. Do you have any idea of the risk you're running, with so many women in this world?" "I love her," Tony replied with a firmness that warmed my heart. "And those children, too. I couldn't leave them in that situation." "And your future as a lawyer?" I heard Catherine ask, the concern evident in her voice. "If the colonel finds out, you could lose everything." I felt a tightness in my chest. I hadn't realized how much Tony was risking for me. For Ush's career, his reputation, everything was at stake. But Tony seemed determined. "Some things are more important than a career," he said. I couldn't stand by watching Ellie and the children suffer. I went back to the room with a heavy heart, but full of love and gratitude for Tony. A week after our arrival, to my surprise and joy, Tony announced that we would be getting married. It was a simple ceremony at the town's registry office, with only his family present. Louise cried with emotion, while August and Catherine, despite their concerns, hugged us with genuine happiness. The children were radiant. Maggie, in her little white dress, couldn't stop smiling, while John, in Louise's arms, clapped his little hands without understanding much of what was happening. The cousins Alfred, Amelia, and Emily had become great friends with my children and were as excited as they were. After the ceremony, Louise insisted on staying with the children so we could have our honeymoon. Go," she said, pushing us out of the house. "Enjoy this moment together." Tony took me to a small hotel in the neighboring town. When we were alone in the room, I felt immense nervousness. Tony approached me with a tenderness that completely disarmed me. "Ellie," he said, holding my hands, "I love you. I promise to make you happy for the rest of our lives." That night was wonderful. For the first time, I understood what it was truly like to be loved. With Tony, I discovered that marriage could be a partnership of equals. He always consulted me on important decisions, valued my opinions, and treated me with respect. Unlike Gerald, who had viewed me as property, Tony saw me as a person with dreams and desires of my own. At night, we would sit on the porch after the children were asleep, talking about our hopes for the future or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. This was what love was supposed to be, not possession or control, but mutual respect and tenderness. Tony was gentle, caring, patient. Each touch, each kiss was full of love and respect. I felt truly like a woman, truly loved. Lying in his arms afterward, I allowed myself to dream of the future, a future where I would be happy, where my children would grow up loved and free, a future beside this wonderful man who had risked everything for me. But part of me knew that our journey was far from over. The ghost of my father, the threat of being discovered, still hung over us. But that night, in Tony's arms, I allowed myself to forget all that and just be happy. We returned to Louise's house the next day, ready to start our life together. The children received us with hugs and laughter, and for the first time in a long time, I truly felt at home. The days that followed were of adaptation and planning. Tony began looking for work in the town. It was strange to think that a few months ago, he had left this same town, his homeland, recently graduated in law, to accept a position in a law firm in my town. At the time, it was an opportunity he couldn't refuse, a guaranteed job in a respected law firm, even if it meant moving away from his family. That's how our paths crossed, and now fate was bringing us back to his hometown, but in such different circumstances. While he sought to re-establish himself professionally, I helped Louise with the house and the children. Gradually, we were building our new life, one day at a time. I was already beginning to dream of a peaceful future, away from the shadows of the past. But as the old folks say, when happiness seems complete, that's when destiny decides to play its tricks, and that's exactly what happened to us. "Look, my daughter, let me tell you how it was." Tony came home that day with such a look of woe on his face. I immediately knew it wasn't anything good. He showed me a crumpled paper and said, his voice trembling, "Your father. He filed an ethics complaint against me. Ellie, it was an official notification from the Bar Association. They suspended my lawyer's license. My old man had probably found out we were already married and decided to take revenge on my Tony. They've suspended my lawyer's license," Tony said, falling into a chair. "They say it's only for a while, but with your father involved, I was floored, my child. All of Tony's effort, everything he had fought for in his life, dissolving because of us." "Let's go back," I said desperately. "I'll explain to my father, tell him it was my fault." Tony took my hand, shaking his head. "No, Ellie, if you go back, he'll lock you in that house and never let you leave again. And the children, who knows what he would do." We had been planning our wedding before this happened, but now everything was uncertain. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about everything that had happened, about how my desire to be free had cost Tony so much. His mother pitied me, I know, but I felt her gaze avoiding me. She must have been upset because her son was being harmed because of me. I didn't know where to hide my face. "Look, my child, after that terrible day, we were a bit lost, not really knowing what to do, but God is good and doesn't abandon his children." One day, Tony came home with some news. "Mother, remember Mr. John, the owner of the carpentry shop? Well, he needs someone to help with the paperwork, contracts, and those things. He offered me the job. It wasn't law practice, but at least it was a start." Tony accepted immediately. It didn't pay much, but it was enough for us to get by. He would leave early and return at night, tired but always with a smile on his face. "One day at a time," he would say. It was during this time that I discovered I was pregnant. I was embarrassed, in my mother-in-law's house, one more child. But Tony was so happy that I ended up getting excited too. When I told Louise that she was going to be a grandmother, I thought she would be angry, but it was the opposite. The news seemed to soften her heart. Suddenly, she began treating me differently, with more affection. It was as if that baby had created a bridge between us. "It will be my Tony's first grandchild," she would say, all proud, and started doing everything to please me. She made those delicious dishes that Tony talked about so much, gave me advice about pregnancy, even offered to take care of Maggie and John when I was very tired. "You know, my child, what I'm going to say now is difficult for me to admit, but Louise was like a mother to me, a mother I had always dreamed of having, because mine never did any of this for me. She always had the opportunities, but never did anything. The children, thank God, were adapting well. At first it was difficult, poor things, everything new, school, but soon they made new friends. Maggie, always chatty, was already popular at school. John took a little longer, but ended up fitting in too. Time passed, and my belly grew. Tony, even tired from work, always found time to talk to the baby. "He's going to be a lawyer like his father," he would joke. When Annie was born, she was so tiny, but already the owner of the place. Tony couldn't contain his happiness, and Louise, my goodness, spent the day pampering us, helping with the baby, cooking, taking care of the children. Over the next few years, our family continued to grow. In 1964, we welcomed our son Luke, and 2 years later, Vincent completed our family in 1966. Each birth brought new joy and strengthened the loving home we were building together. It was during this time that Dr. Gerald Wilson appeared at our door, an old lawyer friend of Tony's father. He had heard about our situation and came to offer help. "Your father was a man of integrity, Tony," he said. "I can't watch his son being wronged like this. It was as if God had sent an angel, my child." Dr. Wilson began to mobilize his contacts, along with other friends of Tony's late father. They reopened the case, presented evidence that the accusations were false, showed Tony's character. It was 2 years of struggle, my child. 2 years of anxiety, of hope mixed with fear. But Tony didn't give up. He studied at night after work at the carpentry shop, on weekends went to talk with Dr. Wilson, prepare the defense. And when we least expected it, the news came they had returned the license to Tony. Ave Maria, what joy! We cried, laughed, hugged each other. The children didn't really understand what was happening, but they were happy because we were happy. We discovered that there were more people on our side than we had imagined. Tony's family, who at first was afraid, ended up being our greatest support. His father's friends, who didn't even know us, came together to help us. Even some of Tony's old clients came to offer work when they heard he had recovered his license. Of course, not everything became perfect right away. We still had a long road ahead. Tony would have to rebuild his career practically from scratch. Despite everything we went through, Tony and I managed to build a beautiful family. Besides Maggie and John, who came with me from that old life, we had 3 more children, Annie, Luke, and Vincent. Over time, we managed to save a little money and bought a house not far from Louise's. It was a simple house, but it was ours. We paid for it, but each installment was a victory. We could walk to visit Louise, who was delighted to have her grandchildren nearby. I dedicated myself to the house and the children. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was full of love. Tony worked hard at the law firm he opened and gradually regained his reputation. The children grew up, studied, graduated. We didn't have much, but we never lacked the essentials. Of my parents and my old family, I never heard news again. At first, I would check, but with time, you learn to live with the scars. You know, sometimes I would catch myself thinking about them, wondering how they were, but I never tried to make contact. I was afraid of what might happen. The children grew up hearing our story. We never hid anything from them. Maggie and John always knew that Tony wasn't their biological father, but for them, he was always Dad in everything that mattered. They called him Dad from when they were little, and the love between them was real. Maggie, our firstborn, had just gotten married. It was a beautiful celebration, simple but full of love. Seeing my girl in a white dress, entering the church arm in arm with Tonya, my child, it's priceless. It was around this time that life decided to give us another big twist. One day, Tony came home with a strange look, holding an envelope in his hand. "Ellie?" he called me, his voice serious. "This arrived at the office today." It was a letter from a lawyer. My heart froze immediately, but when Tony read the contents, I was floored. It was about my family's plantation. My father had passed away, and the lawyer was summoning me for the reading of the will. After so many years without news, that fell like a bomb. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore that letter, continue with life as if nothing had happened. But another part wanted to know, wanted to understand, wanted to close this chapter of my life. I talked with Tony and the children. To my surprise, they were unanimous that I should go. After all, what could happen? We were all adults now. I was no longer afraid of my father or my family. And the children, well, they had grown up hearing the stories of my old life and were curious to meet this side of the family they had never seen. It was our opportunity, and so we decided to all go together. Even Maggie's husband, Frank, went along. The trip back to my hometown was strange. Each mile covered was like going back in time. I recognized places, remembered moments. Tony held my hand the whole time, giving me strength. When we arrived at the plantation, my heart raced. Everything was different, but at the same time, the big house, the fields, the smell of the earth. It was as if time hadn't passed. I remember thinking the whole time, I wonder if my mother is alive. We were received by the lawyer, a younger man I didn't know. He took us to the room where the will would be read. Inside, I found familiar faces, me brothers, some uncles, cousins, all older of course, but still recognizable. The silence that fell when we entered was heavy. I could feel the gazes upon me, upon my family, some hostile, others curious, few welcoming. My mother wasn't there. I discovered later that she had passed away a few years earlier. That was my biggest fear. I couldn't stop crying. I should have returned for her. Look, if remorse could kill, I would have died at that moment. What pain, my God, what a weight on my heart. The reading of the will was surprising, to say the least. My father, that hard man I knew, seemed to have changed completely in his last years. The lawyer read his words with a solemn voice, and each phrase was like a revelation to me. Later, talking with my brothers, I found out that this change began after the loss of my mother. Her death seems to have softened my father's heart, made him rethink many things. And then came the part that shocked me the most. Father eventually discovered everything. He knew where I was, knew about my children, my new life, and in his later years chose not to harm us, despite that earlier episode with Tony's license. My oldest brother told me, with tears in his eyes, that my father had several chances to cause us harm over the years. He knew where we lived, knew about Tony's office, but surprisingly, he decided not to do anything. He said that you had chosen your path, my brother said. In the will, my father recognized the mistakes of the past. His words were clear and direct, without beating around the bush. He asked for forgiveness for the way he had treated me, for the harshness, for the lack of understanding. He spoke of the remorse he carried for years, of the desire to make peace that he never had the courage to realize in life. My heart almost stopped when he mentioned Tony. That little lawyer, he said, had the audacity to challenge a colonel. He faced an old, stubborn, and powerful man to be with my daughter. In the end, he proved to have more courage than many men out there. And then came the part that no one expected. My father had left me a considerable part of the inheritance. The lawyer cleared his throat before reading this part, as if even he was surprised by the content. To Ellie and her children, the document said, I leave the southern part of Willow Creek Plantation, including the guest house and the 500 adjacent acres. The lawyer paused and then continued. This legacy is made as a form of reparation for the lost years and for the dowry that was rightfully yours. I felt Tony squeeze my hand as a murmur spread through the room. But the lawyer wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, I transfer to Ellie the amount resulting from the sale of Pine Valley Plantation, previously property of Gerald Thompson. My heart almost stopped upon hearing my ex, husband's name. The lawyer proceeded. This amount, as detailed in the financial annex, represents the partial value of the sale divided with the other heirs, with the due interest accumulated over the last 30 years. I understood that it was my part of the sale of the mansion and lands that father had sold and divided with Gerald's 3 children. I was breathless. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in my life. In the will, my father explained that he was returning to me what was rightfully mine. I know that nothing can compensate for the lost time, the will said. But I hope this can give you and your children the security and opportunities that I, in my stubbornness and pride, denied you in the past. I looked at my children, at Tony, all with eyes wide with astonishment. It wasn't just the material value, which was already impressive in itself. It was the recognition, the admission of mistakes, the attempt to make peace, even if belatedly. The buzz in the room was immediate. My brothers seemed shocked, some uncles indignant, but I didn't know what to feel. It was a mixture of relief, sadness, anger, and somehow, gratitude. We left there with more questions than answers. In the days that followed, while we resolved the paperwork, I gradually reconnected with some people from the family. Some were still hurt, others were happy to see me. When we returned home, everything changed dramatically. We arrived home 2 days later, suddenly rich. Tony's family couldn't believe what was happening when we told them the news. Their faces were a mixture of shock and joy. Seemingly overnight, I had a plantation and more money than I knew how to count. We never went hungry before, thankfully. Tony always managed to put food on the table, even when things were tight. But suddenly, we had wealth beyond our imagination. I confess something to you, I never expected a single penny from my old father. That man only took from me my whole life. I thought I had been disinherited long ago. When I heard the will, I almost fell backward. Well, Tony and I sat down and thought carefully about what we would do with all that money. The first thing was to buy our big house, the one we had always dreamed of. Oh, what joy it brought us. I also hired a daily cleaner rather than a permanent maid, as I never felt comfortable with strangers in our home every day. It was important for us to maintain some privacy despite our newfound wealth. You know what else Tony and I did? We went on our real honeymoon, the kind where you travel far and spend days away from home. That's right, after 50 years. Look, if you never had the chance when you were young or because of the children, and you can do it when you get older, it's wonderful. It does a lot of good for the couple's routine. The years went by, the children grew up, the grandchildren came. Today I even have great-grandchildren. Look at that, a large and happy family, thank God. Life is very different now with all this technology. I have 2 great-grandsons who are famous YouTubers. Can you believe it? I myself have my cell phone. I know how to use it properly. But you know, my child, what gives me such great sadness? My Tony, who passed away 8 years ago at the age of 89, after we celebrated our 65th wedding anniversary together. Ah, how that man is missed. Sometimes I wake up at night and stretch my arm, looking for him in bed. I will always say that he was my prince. After all, he rescued me from the villain's castle, didn't he? We went through so much together, built everything from scratch. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about him, that beautiful smile, the caring way he had. I remember as if it were today, the day we returned home after receiving the inheritance. Tony, always sensible, said, "Ellie, let's take it easy. This money is a blessing, but we have to use it wisely." And that's what we did. We helped the children, of course. Maggie, who was already married and living in a rented apartment, could finally buy her own house. John used part of it to open his business. Annie, Luke, and Vincent were still studying, so we saved a good amount for their college. Time passed, the grandchildren started coming. What joy to see the family grow. Each birth was a celebration. We made a point of helping the children with the babies, bought everything. Ah, and the Christmas parties were crazy. The house would be full of grandchildren running everywhere. Tony would dress up as Santa Claus, distribute presents. There was food that never ended. The table was bountiful. You should see it. Ah, my child, let me tell you something that warmed my heart. With all this money, we were able to help a lot of people. There was Sophie, our neighbor of many years. Poor thing was going through a terrible time. Her husband had lost his job, and her youngest son, Joey, needed some expensive medication. One day, I saw Sophie crying hidden in the yard. I went there and asked what was happening. She reluctantly told me about the situation. Right away, I told Tony, let's help them. We paid for Joey's medicines, helped with the overdue bills, and even found a job for her husband on the plantation we had inherited. They rented out their house in town and became our trusted caretakers. Ave Maria, you should have seen the joy of that family, Sophie cried, but now it was with happiness. And it didn't stop there. There was Jack, the shoemaker on the corner. The man was about to close his little shop because the rent had increased too much. We bought the place for him. Now Jack works without worrying about rent and even teaches the craft to the young people in the neighborhood. This profession is scarce nowadays. It's very important to pass on the knowledge of a shoemaker. And the neighborhood school was falling apart. We gathered a group, took up a collection we entered with most of it, of course, and renovated everything. It's a beauty now. The children even have a brand new library. You know, my child, being able to help others like this, there's no money in the world that can pay for it. Seeing the smile on people's faces, knowing that we made a difference in their lives, that is real wealth. Tony always said, Ellie, we received this blessing to multiply, and that's what we did. We multiplied the joy. Oh, my dear child, that's the story of my life, a journey from darkness into light. If there's anything I want you to remember from my tale, it's this. No matter how difficult life becomes, don't give up hope. I was a frightened child bride who became a strong, independent woman. I found love when I least expected it. I built a family filled with the love I never had as a child. And most importantly, I learned that it's never too late for forgiveness and healing. You know, life is like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. But it's the powerful currents that create the most beautiful, smooth pebbles. Every wound, every tear is a lesson. I've learned that true strength isn't about never falling, but about rising every time we fall. Remember that time is the most precious gift. Don't waste it on resentment and regret. Instead, cherish every moment with those you love. Because at the end of life, it's not material possessions, but memories and love that will warm your heart. I also want you to understand that happiness is not a destination, but how we journey. It lies in the small daily joys, a smile, a hug, a hot cup of tea on a rainy day. Learn to find joy in simple things, and you will never be disappointed. May you find your own path to happiness as I eventually found mine. And may God bless you and your family, always. If these heartfelt words and life lessons have touched your hearts, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more meaningful stories and valuable advice from life. Press the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Thank you for listening to my story today.